A man in a gray overcoat came down our street apologizing to people who had not yet been inconvenienced. He had a plastic folder under his arm and a lanyard with no photograph on it. And he stood back from every doorstep, the polite distance, the distance you learn if your job involves knocking on doors where somebody has just died. That was how I noticed him. He stood the way I stand. The vehicles had come before he did. 14 of them, black, the big square kind with the tinted glass, and they were parked all around our block in a way that made no sense if you knew the parking on Ovenden Row, which I did, because I had reversed a van into every awkward gap on that street for 11 years. 2 on the corner by the post box. 3 along the back of Cropper Lane where the bin lorry needs the turning circle. 1 with 2 wheels up on the pavement outside number 9, which is the sort of thing that gets a man's tires let down in Netherbeck. And nobody touched it. I asked the man in the gray coat who had sent him. He said nobody sent him. He said it twice in the same flat voice, and then he apologized again for any disruption. And he said the words that I then carried up and down my own street for the rest of the day, like a man carrying a bucket with a hole in it. He said it was only a survey. I've had 8 months to think about what I should have said next. And the honest answer is that I would have needed to be a different man to say it. So this is the account of a man who was not different, and what it cost the people who lived on my road, and what happened in a swimming baths that had been shut for 15 years. My name is Malcolm Beattie. I was 52 that February. I drove a private ambulance, which is what we called it, though there was nothing ambulant about the work. When somebody died at home, or in a care home, or in one of the sheltered flats up on Gascoigne Street, and a doctor had been and gone and the paperwork was clean, I went and collected them. 2-man job when I could get a second man. 1-man job more often than the rules liked. I had a long wheelbase van with a low floor and an aluminium ramp, and a trolley with a bad left caster that shuddered on tiles and gave me away in quiet corridors. I had a box of blue gloves in the door pocket, and I went through them faster than the company liked because I would rather look wasteful than touch anything twice. You learn a particular skill in that job, and it isn't lifting, it's arriving. You come into a house on the worst morning that house has ever had, and you have 4 or 5 minutes to make it clear that you know what you are doing and that you are not going to make anything worse. You say very little. You keep your coat on until you are ready. You use the person's name once, early, because relatives need to hear it said normally by someone who isn't crying. And then you do the practical thing, and you say the practical sentence. And the practical sentence is nearly always a slight simplification of the truth, because the truth on those mornings is longer than anybody can hold. That was the shape of my working life. And I want to set it down plainly, because it explains the mistake. I was a man who did things when he was authorized to do them. Forms first. A doctor's signature, a coroner's officer's go-ahead, a next of kin's yes. I did not push, I did not improvise, and when somebody with a lanyard told me a thing, I passed the thing on in the words I had been given. 11 years of doing that well will hollow a certain muscle out of you. By the last week of February, I could no longer tell the difference between being careful and waiting for permission. There was one person I owed something to, and I want him in the record early. My son, Louis. He was 24, and he worked nights at the distribution park out at Halbeck, 9 miles east of us, picking orders on a scanner from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. His mother had been gone 3 years by then, and Louis and I had settled into the sort of arrangement where we texted about football and saw each other every second Sunday for a roast at the same carvery. And neither of us ever said out loud that it wasn't enough. He phoned me twice in the fortnight before all this to ask whether he should be worried about anything because he had heard things on the shift. And both times I told him what I had been told. And both times he said all right then, Dad, and rang off. Before the vehicles, before the man in the gray coat, my job had already been telling me something for 3 weeks, and I had not been listening properly because the change came in the language and not in the work. The volume went up first. In an ordinary February, I might do 9 or 10 removals a week across the east of the city. In the last week of January, I did 19. The next week, I did 26. When it goes like that, you assume flu and cold snaps, and the ordinary arithmetic of old people in bad houses in a wet winter. And you drink more tea in the van, and you don't think about it, because thinking about it is not what you are paid for. Then the addresses started clustering. 4 in 1 week off Salt Lane, 3 from the same sheltered block, 2 doors apart on Bethel Street, 8 days between them, which is common enough with couples and not common with strangers. I mentioned it to the coroner's officer, a careful woman called Bridget Nowak, who had a way of looking at you over her glasses that made you check your own sentences. She said she had noticed. She said she had put it in writing. She said she had not had a reply. And she said it in a tone that told me she had put it in writing more than once. The third thing was the wording. Our removal forms had a box for presenting circumstances, and it had always been filled in with whatever the attending doctor said and no more. In the first week of February, we were told, by email, from an address I did not recognize, to leave that box blank and to write only the referral code. No reason given. A week after that, we were told not to accept any removal where the household reported a recent respiratory illness in a person under 60 without ringing the duty number first. And when I rang the duty number twice, it was answered by somebody who took my details and told me somebody else would call me back. And nobody ever did. I did 9 jobs that fortnight where I should have rung and didn't ring, because the alternative was leaving a family sitting in a front room with a body in it, while a phone line went nowhere. And there was the mortuary. Halfway through February, the hospital mortuary at St. Ninian's stopped taking anything after 4 in the afternoon. Then it stopped taking anything without an appointment slot. Then, on the Monday of the last week, the porter I had known for a decade came out to the bay in his coat and said, not unkindly, that I would need to take my 2 down to the site at Marley Cross instead. And when I asked what was at Marley Cross, he said a lot of refrigerated containers and a security man with a clipboard. And he looked at the ground while he said it. I drove out to Marley Cross that afternoon. It was a yard behind a closed tile warehouse, and there were 11 white containers in it with their compressors running, and a portable cabin, and 2 men in high-visibility coats who were very polite and who did not write anything down that I could see. On the way out, I passed 3 black vehicles parked nose out along the fence, the same square kind, tinted, engines off, nobody visible inside them. I remember thinking that somebody had put a lot of money into this and told nobody about it. And then I remember thinking that it was not my place to have opinions about the coroner's estate, and I drove home with my hands loose on the wheel. That was the Monday. On the Thursday morning, the 14 vehicles were on my own street. I came off a night call at about 7:30 and turned into Ovenden Row and had to stop, because there was a black bonnet where my parking space had been for 11 years. I sat with the engine running for a while. Then I walked the block, all 4 sides of it, and counted. Because counting is what I do when I don't know what else to do. And I got 14. Here is what I did not understand, until much later, and what I will not pretend I understood that morning. I only saw where they were parked. I did not see what they were parked outside of. Yvonne Trickett came out of number 22 in her dressing gown with a coat over it, because Yvonne came out of number 22 for everything. She was 66, and she ran the street the way a good foreman runs a yard, which is to say by knowing everybody's business, and never once mentioning the parts you would mind her knowing. She had the keys to 4 houses on that road for parcels and cats. She said, "Malcolm, what are all these?" And I said I didn't know. And she said, "Well, Ask, you've got the coat for it. And that was the truth, because I did have the coat for it. People answer a man in a dark coat with a lanyard. I got as far as the window of the one outside number 9 and rapped on the glass with 2 knuckles, and nothing happened, and nothing kept happening. And I put my face nearer and could see a shape in the driver's seat that did not turn its head. Then the man in the gray overcoat came round the corner from Cropper Lane with his folder. And he asked me if I lived here. And I said I did. And he apologized for the disruption. And I asked him whose vehicles they were. And he said nobody sent him. I want to be careful about him, because in the months since I have heard 100 versions of men like that, and most of them are rubbish. He was ordinary, 50 maybe. He had a cold sore at the corner of his mouth and cheap shoes and a folder with printed sheets in it. And when the wind took a corner of a sheet, he trapped it against his chest with his forearm like anybody would. He was not frightening. He was worse than frightening. He was somebody doing a job he had been told not to explain. And I recognized him. Because I'd been doing a job I was told not to explain for 3 weeks. I asked him if it was to do with the deaths. That was the one brave thing I did that morning. And it came out of my mouth by accident. He looked at me for a second longer than he needed to. Then he said that today was about accommodation, and that people should stay in their homes, and that there would be a fuller communication in due course, and that there was no cause for alarm because it was only a survey. Then he went up the step at number 9 and knocked, and Errol Beckles opened it in his slippers. And I heard the man start again with the apology. I stood in the road with my keys in my hand, and I made the decision that this whole account is about. I went and told my street that it was only a survey. I did it well too, that's what I think about. I did it with the voice I use in front rooms. Yvonne had already got 8 or 9 of them out on the pavement by then. And there was the beginning of the sort of noise a street makes when it is about to do something. Dariusz Volak's brother-in-law saying he was going to block one of them in with his flatbed. A woman from the top end saying she'd already rung the police twice and got a recorded message. Hamza Qureshi standing at the curb with his phone up, filming. Because Hamza was 31 and filming things was what his generation did instead of shouting. And I came in among them with my hands out and my coat on. And I said that I had spoken to the officer, that it was a survey to do with accommodation, that the advice was to stay indoors, and that there would be a fuller communication in due course. Every word of that was a word he had given me. Not one of them was mine. And it worked, the way arriving works, because I sounded like a man who knew what he was doing. And Yvonne said, right, well, that's that then. And she started sending people back in for their breakfasts, and the street came down off the boil in about 4 minutes. Hamza put his phone away and said quietly, so nobody else got it. You believe that? I said the officer had been clear. He said, that's not what I asked you. I did my round that day. That is the second thing I think about. Nobody had told me to stop, so I didn't stop. 2 jobs in the morning, both on Salt Lane, both households with the curtains shut in the middle of the day and a smell of bleach in the hall. In the second one, a young lad let me in, and there was an older man on the settee with a blanket over him and a bowl of water beside him. And the lad said that was his uncle, and that his uncle had a temperature, and was there anything they should do? And I said I wasn't medical, and he should ring 111. He said he had. He said he had been on hold for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and then it had cut off. He showed me the screen with the call time on it, like it was a bus ticket he needed to prove. I went out to the van, and I sat there, and I rang the duty number, and got the recorded voice, And I rang Bridget Nowak, and she didn't answer. And then I drove to my next job, which was the last job I ever did with any paperwork behind it. By 4 o'clock, the city had that particular Sunday feeling that a weekday should never have. The ring road was solid in both directions and moving in neither. And I sat in it for 50 minutes and watched people do the things people do. A man in a hatchback pulled onto the hard shoulder and drove up it at 50 until he met a van coming the other way doing the same thing. And then both of them sat there with the horns going. 2 lanes over, a woman was crying and talking on a phone she was holding in her steering hand. The petrol station at the Outbreak junction had a queue coming out of it and back along the slip road. And somebody had already had a fight at the pumps, because there was a wing mirror on the tarmac, and a man sitting on a curb with his hand over his eye, and nobody looking at him. The radio was the strangest part. There was a national statement at 2, and it used the phrase "a localized elevation in respiratory presentations." And it said that a small number of areas were being asked to limit non-essential movement, and it named my city among 4. It did not say what was happening. It said that arrangements were being made. At 3:30, a local station started taking calls, and the callers knew more than the statement did, and none of them agreed with each other. One woman said there were soldiers at Marley Cross. A man said his sister worked at St. Ninian's, and they had stopped writing certain things down. Somebody rang in to say that vaccination was being given out at the Netherbeck Leisure Center from 6 that evening. First come, first served. And the presenter said he couldn't confirm that. And it did not matter in the slightest that he couldn't confirm it. Because by 5 o'clock, there were 400 people outside the leisure center in the rain. I know there were 400 because I drove past on my way home, and I could not get down Bethel Street for them. And I had to go round by the depot and the old baths, and that was the accident that saved us. I will come back to it. The people outside the leisure center had brought their families. That is the thing I would want anybody to hear. They had brought their mothers in wheelchairs and their kids in pushchairs with the rain covers on, and they were standing in a car park in February for something a stranger had said on the radio. And they stood there for 6 hours. And at some point in the night, the doors were opened by somebody who should not have opened them. And the crowd went inside out of the wet, 400 people into a sports hall with 2 doors and no water. I went home. I want that stated flatly because I have heard myself soften it in the retelling. And I would like to stop. I drove past 400 people who were making a mistake. And I went home, and I put the kettle on. The street was quiet. 11 of the 14 vehicles were still there at 7 o'clock, and the man in the gray coat had gone. I rang Lewis, and he answered from the locker room at Outbreak and said they had been told the site was staying open because it was critical national infrastructure, which is a phrase somebody had clearly handed him the way one had been handed me. And I said, "You should come here." He said, "You're on the list of areas, Dad." I'm not. That was true. It was the correct reading of the information available. I said, "All right then." And I told him to keep his phone charged. And he said he loved me in the fast way lads do when other lads are in the room. And I said the same. And that was the last conversation I had with my son. The next morning, Yvonne knocked on my door at 6:10. And she had her coat on properly, and she had somebody else's cat under her arm. And she said, "Malcolm, come and look at Bethel Street." We walked down to the corner. There were maybe 30 people in the road, and it took me some time to understand what was wrong with them, because there was nothing dramatic about it at all. They were standing. They were standing where people stand. There was a woman at the bus stop with her bag over her arm, facing the way the bus comes. There were 4 of them queued at the shutter of the newsagents, which opens at 6:30 on weekdays. There was a man on the pavement outside the primary school gate with his hand out at the height of a child's hand. They were very warm. You could see it in the way the rain sat on them and steamed off. Nobody was talking. Every so often, one of them would go a few steps and then stop again. And it was the going that made your skin move, because they went with intention. They went like people who had somewhere to be and were early. Yvonne said, "That's Denny Prosser. He does the 6:40 into town." Errol Beckles came up behind us with a length of copper pipe in his hand, which is what a retired gas fitter reaches for. And he looked at them for a long time, and then he said, "They're keeping hours." We watched from the corner until 7:20. At about 10 past, the four at the newsagent's shutter began to push at it, all together, without any noise except the noise of the shutter. And the man from the school gate came up the road towards them at a pace that was much faster than the walking had been. And Errol put his arm across my chest without saying anything. And the three of us went backwards up Ovenden Row and did not run until we were level with number 9. That is what they were, and that is nearly all I ever learned about them. They kept to what their bodies had known. If a man had walked to the same shutter at the same minute for 9 years, that is where he went. And he went there, hot and silent. And when the thing he expected did not happen, he pushed. And if you were between him and it, you were the thing he pushed. They were slow when they were early. They were quick when they were late. The cold took the strength out of them over hours, and the wet took it faster. And I would come to build the rest of my life around those two facts. But on that first morning, all we had was Errol's phrase, and Errol's phrase was enough to keep 11 of us alive. I did not go back inside and wait for a fuller communication. This is the one place where I moved before somebody told me to. And I've wondered since whether I only managed it because moving was, technically, my job. I got the van. I told Yvonne to get everybody who would come out onto the pavement in 15 minutes, with 1 bag each and any medication they had. And she looked at me and said, "Where?" And I said, "Bethel Street Baths." She said, "It's shut." I said, "I've got a key." Here is why I had a key. And it is the least mysterious part of this whole account. When the council had drawn up its plans for a mass fatality event, years before, they had listed suitable premises. And the old Bethel Street Baths came out near the top, because it was a big municipal building with a tiled interior, floor drainage, a service yard with vehicle access, a boiler house, and crucially, no residents anywhere near it, being backed on 2 sides by the tram depot wall. 2 summers before all this, my company had been asked to send someone to walk the site with an emergency planning officer and confirm we could get a long wheelbase van into the yard and a trolley up the ramp to the pool hall. I was the someone. The caretaker who let us in was a man called Colin Sowerby, who kept his lunch in the old ticket booth and had a kettle on an extension lead. And at the end of the visit, he cut me a spare key for the yard gate and the plant room door, because he said he was buggered if he was coming down at 4 in the morning for a van. I had never used it. It had been on the ring with my garage padlock key for 2 years, doing nothing. 9 of us went that morning, and it should have been more. Bridget Nowak was already gone to work. The family at the top end would not come out, because the man of the house said the advice was to stay indoors, and the advice was on the radio, and I was not on the radio. And I could not argue with that, because I was the man who had told him to stay indoors the day before. Bilal Qureshi, Hamza's older brother, was 3 streets over on Gascoigne with his wife and their 2, and Hamza went for them on foot at 9 and came back at 11 without them, because Bilal had said the same thing. "We're staying put. They'll tell us when." He'd said something else as well, which Hamza told me a fortnight later and which I've not put down until now. Bilal had said, Your neighbor with the van told everyone it was a survey. The drive was 2/3 of a mile, and it took 40 minutes. Cropper Lane was blocked by a delivery lorry that had been abandoned across it with the cab door open. And the way round was through the alley behind the shops, which the van fits down with about 4 inches on either side. And I've taken it 100 times at 3 in the morning, and never once with 9 people in the back and a woman of 90 in the passenger seat. Halfway along, one of them came out of the yard door of the bakery ahead of us, the bakery man, who would have been in since 4, and stood in the middle of the alley with flour still on his forearms. I stopped. Everyone in the back went quiet without being asked, which tells you something about how fast a group learns. He looked at the van. Then he turned and walked back through the yard door. And I understood something that I did not have words for until later. It was 8:10. His bread would have gone out at 7. He was not late, and he was not early, and he had nothing to push against, and so he went back to where his hands knew. I put the van in gear, and we came out onto Bethel Street and turned in at the yard gate, and Colin Sowerby was standing in the middle of the yard with a shovel. He said, "Malcolm Beattie." Then he said, "I know why you're here." And he moved to open the second gate before anybody had asked him anything. I need to describe the building, because everything that happened afterwards happened because of how it was built. Bethel Street Baths went up in 1904 and closed in 2009. From the street, it was red brick and stone, with a big arched window over the door, and the word "Baths" carved into the lintel. And the council had put steel screens over the ground floor windows and a hoarding across the front steps. Inside it was cold and enormous, and smelled of dust and iron. You came through the ticket hall, past a wooden booth with a brass grill, into the main pool hall, which was the size of a church and had a barrel roof with a glazed lantern along the ridge and a gallery running round 3 sides. The pool itself had been drained for years. It was a tiled hole, 8 feet deep at the far end and 3 at the near, and you could go down into it by the steps in the corner. And standing in the bottom of an empty swimming pool is one of the strangest experiences available to a person, because the sound goes wrong and your body keeps expecting water. Off the pool hall on one side were the old changing cubicles, 2 rows of them, wooden doors and slate partitions. On the other side, through a fire door, were the slipper baths, a corridor of small rooms where working men used to pay 2 for a hot bath. 20 little rooms with big cast iron tubs still in them, and taps that still worked because the water main was still live. At the back was the plant room with the boiler in it, and beyond that, the service yard where the coal used to come in, now big enough for 2 vans and a skip. And in the roof, over the plant room, there was a header tank. Colin took me up the ladder on the first afternoon and showed me. A big galvanized cistern, maybe 400 gallons, gravity-fed to the whole building, full. Colin had kept the stopcock open and the tank in service for 15 years, so the pipes wouldn't seize, which was the single most useful act of stubbornness in the history of that district. The boiler was a gas beast the size of a transit, and the gas was still on, because the meter was in the council's name, and no one had ever closed the account. Errol Beckles spent 5 hours with it on the second day, and got the wet system going into 3 of the slipper baths and the plant room. And by way of a length of 10 mil pipe and a lot of language, into 2 of the changing cubicles. That meant we had 4 warm rooms in a building with 14,000 square feet of cold in it. That was our whole world for the next 11 weeks. 4 warm rooms, 1 live tank, 1 working van, and a pool. We were 9 on the first day. By the end of the first week, we were 19, and then we lost 2, and then we were 23. I did the inventory the way I do a job sheet, because it was the only method I had. On the Friday evening, I sat in Colin's ticket booth with his kettle and his extension lead, which no longer worked because the power was off. And I wrote down what we had. Colin's stores from the depot. Rock salt, 70 bags. 2 pallets of council-issue bin bags. Traffic cones, a pressure washer. 4 rolls of blue paper. Half a drum of diesel and a petrol strimmer. In the old kiosk, from when the baths had a vending machine and a sweet counter. 3 boxes of chocolate bars, 12 years out of date, which we ate in April and which were fine. Food that people had carried in. 41 tins, mostly tomatoes and beans. 2 bags of rice, a bag of flour, 4 boxes of cereal. A leg of frozen lamb that Yvonne had carried half a mile in a bag for life, and which we cooked that night on Colin's camping stove because it was going to spoil anyway. Medication. Errol's blood pressure tablets. 3 inhalers. Yvonne's thyroid pills with 19 days in the packet. And a woman called Comfort Mensa's insulin, which was the one number I watched every day and which is a large part of why I ended up walking to Halbeck. Rules came out of me over the first 2 days, and I noticed as I made them that I was not asking anybody's permission. And I noticed how much I disliked doing it. No lights above ground level after dark because of the lantern in the roof. Nobody in the pool hall alone. All doors bolted at their hour. And the hours went on the wall in chalk, 6:30, 8, 9, 3:30, 5, 6:10, 11. We worked those out over the first week by watching from the gallery windows. And they were the shifts and the school runs and the pub turning out of a district of 40,000 people. And they were as regular as tides. The van reverses in, always. Never nose in. If you have to leave, you leave forwards. And one that Yvonne made, and that I would not have thought of. Everybody gets a job, including the ones who can't stand up. She put a woman of 90 in charge of counting tins. For about 10 days, I was happier than I had been in 3 years, and I'm not proud of it. The first thing that broke that was not the people outside. It was the building. On the 4th day, Hamza and Colin walked the whole perimeter with a torch and came back and stood in front of me, and Hamza said, "Malcolm, how many ways in do you think there are?" I said 4. The front steps, the yard gate, the plant room, the fire exit off the slipper baths. He said 11. There was a coal hatch in the yard with a rotten cover. There was a hole in the corrugated sheeting at the back of the tram depot wall where kids had been getting in for years, and behind it a window with no glass. There were 2 grills at pavement level along Bethel Street that dropped into a void under the changing cubicles, and the void connected to the pool hall through a plumbing hatch. There was a door from the old laundry into the alley that had been screwed shut with 4 screws in 1998 and could be opened with a screwdriver and some optimism. There was the lantern in the roof, which nobody could get to, but which every one of us thought about at night. And there was the ladies' entrance on the corner, bricked up but only 1 brick thick, which we knew because Errol tapped it and made a face. We had a building with 11 ways in and 11 of us to hold it. And that was the moment my idea of the place changed. I had walked in there, thinking of a fortress, and I had actually walked into a public building. A public building is designed to let people in. Every single feature of it is an invitation. And we had brought our lives into the middle of the biggest invitation in the district. Which brought us to the Tuesday. It was the 2nd Tuesday, so 11 days in. At 9:20 in the morning, there were 31 of them outside the front steps. We watched from the gallery window, with our hands over our own mouths. They came up Bethel Street from 3 directions, adults mostly, and among them, and this is the part I have never been able to say out loud to anybody who was not there. Among them, there were children, not many, 6 or 7. And they came up the steps and stood at the hoarding where the doors used to be. And they waited, in a loose double file, the way a class waits. Colin said, Tuesday morning was the school's session. It was the school's every Tuesday for 40 years. They stood there for 50 minutes. Then they pushed. The hoarding across the front steps was chipboard on a timber frame, and it went in the middle. And the doors behind it were the original doors with a mortise lock and no bolt. And they came into the ticket hall. And we were on the gallery above with 9 of us, and a copper pipe, and a shovel. We did the only thing there was. Comfort Mensa pulled the fire door to the slipper bath shut behind the last of us, and Colin put the pin in the crash bar. And we went down the corridor into the plant room, and out into the yard, and stood in the rain against the wall of the tram depot. All 9 of us, holding on to each other, for 2 hours and 40 minutes. While noises came out of that building that I'm not going to describe. They went at about 12:30. That was the hour. The session ended. The coaches went. The hall emptied. We went back in and stood in the ticket hall with the doors open behind us and the rain coming in over the tiles. And Errol Beckles said, well, we can't stay. And Yvonne said, we can't go either. So we spent 3 days making the front of that building into something that would not open. And it was the hardest physical work I've ever done. We took the cast iron cubicle partitions out of the changing rooms, which are slate and iron and weigh what a fridge weighs. And we walled the inside of the ticket hall with them, 2 courses deep. And we filled behind them with the 70 bags of rock salt from Colin's depot store, and then with sand out of the pool filter house, and then with the traffic cones, which are useless as ballast, and which we used anyway because we had them. We screwed the laundry door shut with 30 screws and put a cubicle partition against it. We put the pressure washer, the strimmer, and a stack of pallets over the coal hatch, and then poured a wheelbarrow of set hard cement mix down onto it, which did nothing structurally and which made everybody feel better. The grills were the clever one, and it was not my idea. Comfort Mensa was a care assistant, 38, and she had spent 15 years in buildings where the residents wandered. And she looked at the 2 pavement grills and said, don't block them. Sound goes out of there. Then she said, fill the void instead. So we spent a day and a half feeding bin bags of rubble and broken slate down into the void under the changing cubicles until there was no crawl space left. And she stood at the top and told us where to put it. We never used the front of that building again. From then on, we lived at the back, through the yard. And the pool hall was for water and for the dead. And I've not been in a large echoing room since without my chest tightening. The people started coming on the 12th day, and every single one of them changed the arithmetic. Comfort came first, with an old man called Terence Adeyemi from the residential home she worked at, in a wheelchair, having pushed him 1.5 miles. Then Bridget Nowak, the coroner's officer, on foot, in the same clothes she had gone to work in 11 days before, and she would not talk for 2 days, and then talked for 4 hours. Then a lad of 19 called Ashley Prendergast, who had been sleeping in the tram depot and who could climb anything. And on the 16th day, Dariush Volak arrived at the yard gate at 4 p.m. in a minibus with no back doors and 8 residents from the care home on Gascoigne Street. I want to be exact about the arithmetic because that argument went on for weeks and it never really finished. We were 14. He was making us 23. Of his 8, 6 could not walk unaided. 2 were doubly incontinent. 1 had advanced dementia and shouted at night. And all 8 needed feeding by hand or nearly. He had 1 carton of thickener, some pads, and a bag of assorted medication which turned out on inspection to be 4 days' worth of the wrong things. We had 4 warm rooms. I stood at that gate with the chain in my hand for a long time. And Dariush did not beg, which made it worse. He said, I have brought their notes. He said it like it would help. He was a man who had also spent his working life doing things by permission and paperwork. And he had driven a minibus with no back doors across a dead city. And the thing he thought to bring was their notes. Hamza was beside me. He said in a very low voice, "Malcolm, the tank." Because that was the real number. Not food, water, 400 gallons in the roof, plus whatever the main gave us. And the main had gone from a good flow to a dribble in the second week, and would stop altogether in the fourth. 23 people, and 8 of them needing washing twice a day. I let them in. I want to be plain that I did it without consulting anybody, and that I have never been certain it was right. And that certainty is not the same thing as being able to live with the other choice. And it cost us, immediately and permanently, in a way I did not see coming. Because 2 of Dariush's 8 had chest infections when they arrived, and within 9 days, 1 of them was dead, and Comfort had spent nearly half our paracetamol. That was where the thing between me and Hamza Qureshi began properly. He did not raise his voice at the gate. He waited 3 days and then found me in the plant room and said, "You didn't ask. I said there wasn't time." He said, "You didn't ask on Ovenden Row either." Then he said the sentence I still hear. He said, "You just say the thing in the voice and everybody does it." He was right. And worse, he had put his finger on exactly the mechanism. And he had done it without knowing about the man in the gray coat. Because the reason my voice worked was that I had spent 11 years learning to sound like the person who has been authorized. That is a trick. It is a good trick when a family needs to get through the next 4 minutes. It is a catastrophe when the man who authorized you was himself just repeating a phrase off a sheet. The pattern came together in the 4th week, and it came together because of Bridget. We had been keeping the hours in chalk on the plant room wall, and by then it was quite a document. 6:30, 8, 9:05, 3:30, 5, 6:10, 11, and a bad one at 2 in the morning that we could not account for until Colin remembered that the bakery night shift used to change at 2. We had learned to move only in the gaps. We did our water carries at 11 in the morning and our yard work at 1, and never anything at all between 5 and 7 in the evening. Bridget had come to us with nothing but what was in her head, and what was in her head was 3 weeks of a coroner's officer's caseload. She'd been putting things in writing that got no reply. And one evening in the slipper baths, with 4 of us round the boiler pipe, she started listing addresses. She had a memory for them the way I have a memory for parking. And as she went, I found I was seeing them, because I had been to most of them. I had carried people down those stairs. Salt Lane, the Maisonettes, Bethel Street, 2 doors apart, the sheltered block, 2 on Cropper Lane, 1 on Ovenden Row. I said, "Say that last one again." She said the number. Number 9, Ovenden Row. Errol Beckles was sat right there with his blood pressure tablets in his hand. Number 9 is Errol's house. I had made a removal from it on the 3rd of February. His wife. And there had been a black vehicle parked outside it with 2 wheels up on the pavement. I got up and went out into the pool hall on my own, which was against my own rule. And I stood in the bottom of the empty deep end, with a torch off. And I did the thing I do. I counted. 14 vehicles. I could see every one of them. 2 on the corner by the post box, numbers 3 and 5. And I had been to number 5 in the middle of January. 3 along the back of Cropper Lane. I had been to 2 of those, and the 3rd was the sheltered block's rear entrance. Outside 22, which is Yvonne's. And Yvonne's mother had died in that house in December, and I had not done that one. But our company had. 1 outside 41. I had been to 41 on the 29th of January, a woman of 58, presenting circumstances left blank, referral code only. 12 of the 14 were addresses where somebody had died in the previous 5 or 6 weeks. Every one of them a death I or my company had attended. Every one of them, now that I put them side by side, a death where I had been told to leave a box blank or ring a number that nobody answered. 2 of the 14 were not. One was parked outside the alley entrance behind the shops, which is the way I take the van at 3 in the morning, and which is not a house at all. And one was parked on Cropper Lane facing the back gate of Bethel Street Baths. I stood in that pool for a long time. There's no explanation coming, because I never got one. And I've decided to leave the hole in this account exactly the size it actually is. Somebody had a list. The list was not of sick people, because at that point, nobody was sick in any way a stranger could see. The list was of the addresses of the recently dead, and of the routes and premises attached to the man who had collected them. And 8 hours before this district came apart, somebody parked a vehicle at every point on it and sent a man in a gray coat to apologize. I have thought of 11 reasons, and none of them fit all of it. Perhaps they were mapping where it had already been. Perhaps they were waiting to see which houses went next. Perhaps I was, without knowing it, a line on somebody's diagram, and they were standing on the line to see what came along it. What I keep coming back to is smaller, and I cannot get rid of it. If they knew enough to park outside those houses, they knew enough to knock on them and say something true. And they sent a man to say it was a survey. And I took that word out of his mouth and carried it up my own street with my coat on. I told Bridget and Hamza and nobody else. Bridget listened all the way to the end and then said, "I'd have put that in writing too," and laughed in a way that was not a laugh. The 5th week was when we started to fail slowly rather than quickly, which is the way most things end. The water main stopped. Not a drip, nothing. And after 2 days, Colin came down from the roof and said the tank was at about 1/3. We put everybody on 2 liters a day for everything and moved to washing with cloths and boiled tank water. And we opened the pool. That was comfort again. The pool hall had a glazed lantern along the ridge, and that lantern had been leaking for 15 years. Which is why the deep end had a foot of black water in it when we arrived, and why we had all been very careful about the steps. So we cleaned it. 4 of us in the bottom of a Victorian swimming pool with brushes and the last of the bleach. And then we ran a length of the strimmer's fuel hose and 2 downpipes off the lantern gutters straight down into the shallow end. And after the first proper rain, we had 11 inches of gray water across the shallow end, and a rota of people boiling it in stock pots over Colin's stove. And when the gas went, over a fire we built in the pool filter house with the chimney taken through a broken pane. It tasted of slate, and it kept 23 people alive for 9 weeks. The gas went in the 6th week, and with it, the boiler and the 4 warm rooms. That was the day I understood what winter is. We moved everybody into the slipper bath corridor, which was the smallest volume we had. 20 little rooms off one passage, and we burned the wooden cubicle doors from the changing rooms, and then the gallery benches, and then, at the end, the joists out of the ticket booth. 2 people to a slipper bathroom, sleeping on cushions and cast iron tubs, which sounds like a joke and which is actually the warmest place in an unheated building, because iron holds what you give it. And in the 7th week, Yvonne Trickett went back to Ovenden Row. I need to lay out how that happened, because it did not come out of nowhere, and because it came out of me. She had been getting quieter for a fortnight. Yvonne was a woman who ran things, and by then there was less and less to run. and I had taken the water row to offer because Comfort was better at it. And I had not thought about what that did. And she had the keys. 4 houses on that road, for parcels and cats. She had been saying, on and off since the 2nd week, that there were people up the top end who had stayed in because of what was said on the Thursday. And she had said it in a way that included me, without ever once being unkind about it. One evening in the slipper bath, she said, "Malcolm, do you think they're still in there?" I said I didn't know. She said, "You told them to stay in." I said, "I told them what I was told." And she looked at me for a while, and then she said, "That's not the same as it not being you." 3 days later, she went out at 3:30 in the afternoon with her coat on, and a bag of tins and 4 keys. And she did not tell anybody, and she did not take a second person, both of which were rules she had helped write. 3:30 was the school run. It is on the wall in chalk in my own handwriting. We knew it about 4 because Comfort found her bed empty and her tablets gone from the shelf. Hamza and Ashley got up onto the gallery roof by the tram depot wall, which was the highest we could get, and from there you can see the top of Ovenden Row over the shop roofs, maybe 400 yards. I was on the ground in the yard with the van keys in my hand, and Colin Sowerby stood in front of the gate. He said, "It's 4 o'clock." I said, "Move." He said, "It's 4 o'clock, Malcolm." I got in the van. I want that on the record. I got in the van, and I started the engine, which meant noise, in the yard, at 4 in the afternoon, which was the single most dangerous thing anybody did in that building in 11 weeks. Hamza came down off the roof so fast he tore his hand open on the sheeting, and he got to the driver's door, and he did not try to stop me. He said, "She's on the pavement outside 22, and there's about 40 of them between here and there." I asked him if she was moving. He said, "She sat down." I turned the engine off. I sat in that van in the yard with my hands on the wheel, and I did nothing. And after a while, Colin put his hand flat on the bonnet and left it there, the way you would on an animal. She was still there in the morning, and she was not there by the afternoon. And I'm not going to write anything else about that. Hamza did not say a word to me for 9 days. When he did, it was in the pool filter house while we were feeding the fire, and he said, "My brother's on Gascoigne." And I said, "I know." And he said, "I'm not going for him." And I said, "I know." And he sat down on an upturned crate and put his hands over his face. And I stood there and did not touch him, because that is what I have been trained to do in front rooms. And it was wrong. And I knew it was wrong at the time. 2 days after that, I lost the van. It was the 2nd week of April by then, and the thaw had started. And something had happened in the pipes under Bethel Street, because there was water running down the gutter past the yard gate that had nothing to do with rain. Comfort's insulin had 9 days left in it, and it needed to be cold, and the cold was going. There was a pharmacy on the ring road, 1.5 miles, and a wholesaler's depot behind the retail park at Halbeck that Ashley swore had a chiller full of stock and an unlocked roller shutter. I said I would go at 11 in the morning, which was a gap. I took Ashley and Errol, and we reversed out of the yard, forwards out, as per the rule. And we got as far as the underpass at the bottom of Bethel Street, where the road goes under the tram line, and the underpass had 4 foot of standing water in it because the pumps had not run in 9 weeks. And there was a bus in it, side on. The way round was the alley behind the shops. I knew the alley, 4 inches either side. I had taken it 100 times. I took it at 11 in the morning in April with 2 men in the back, and I was 2/3 of the way along when the yard door of the bakery opened. Not 1, 11 or 12, and behind them the yard, and behind the yard the loading bay of the shop next door. And they had been in there for weeks, because it was where their hands knew. And the alley is the way the delivery comes. There is no reverse gear in a situation like that, or rather there is. And I found it. And the van's back end went into the brick at the corner where the alley kinks and stuck. And the noise of the engine at that hour in that space brought more of them out of the loading bay behind us. We got out through the driver's door and over a wall into the yard of the laundrette and along the roof of the bin store and down onto Salt Lane. And Errol Beckles, who was 68, went over that wall like a man of 30 and then sat down on the pavement on the other side and could not get his breath for 4 minutes while Ashley and I stood over him. We walked back to the baths the long way and got in at 1 o'clock. The van stayed in that alley. I could see the roof of it from the gallery window for the rest of the time we were there. And what went with it was not just a vehicle. It was the ramp and the trolley and my ability to move anybody who could not walk. 22 people, 6 of whom could not stand up, and no wheels. We got insulin in the end, in a way I still find funny in a bad way. Bridget Nowak walked to the pharmacy on the ring road with Ashley on foot at 11 at night, and the pharmacy had been emptied of everything except the fridge, because looters take what they know, and nobody in a panic takes insulin. There were 41 boxes in it. It had not been cold for 9 weeks, and about half of it was no good. And we used the rest, and it worked well enough. And Comfort Mensa is alive today, because a lot of frightened people did not know what they were looking at. But the van was the end of something. After the van, the answer to every question was no. And I stopped being a man who arrived, and became a man who was in a building. And that is when I decided to go to Halbeck. I would like to say it was a decision. It was more that it stopped being possible not to. 9 weeks with no word. There had been a helicopter twice and a broadcast on Bridget's wind-up radio at the end of March that said very little in a great many words. And there had been one convoy of vehicles along the top of Bethel Street in the middle of April, going somewhere, not stopping. And among them, at the back, 2 of the black square kind. I told Comfort and Bridget on a Tuesday, not asked, told, and I heard myself do it, and I saw Comfort hear it too. Comfort said, 9 miles. I said, along the tram line, and then the rail path. There's nothing along the rail path. Nobody ever went along the rail path at any particular time. Bridget said, and if he's there, I said I would bring him back. Bridget said, and if he's not there. And I said the true thing, which I had not said out loud yet, which was that Lewis's shift ended at 6 in the morning, and that if he was still keeping to anything, he would be in that car park at 6 in the morning. And I would know. I left at 9 at night, and I walked all night. And I would rather not go through it hour by hour. The tram line was clear because tram lines are fenced, and nobody's routine involves walking down one. The rail path was a black tunnel of hawthorn for 4 miles. And I heard things in it twice, and both times I got down in the ditch and put my forehead in the wet leaves and waited. And both times, whatever it was, had somewhere to be and went past me. The bit I did not expect was the villages. There are 2 between us and Halbeck, and they were fine. Lights in windows. A pallet barricade across the lane at Netherfield with 2 men on it. And a brazier, and they let me stand 50 feet off and talk. And they told me they had lost 11 people in the first fortnight, and nobody since, because they had worked out the hours in the first week. And a man on that barricade said the same thing Errol said in the road on the second morning. He said, "They keep hours." He said it like it was the weather. I asked him if anybody official had been. He said a van had come round on the 9th of March and taken a list of names and not come back. I got to the edge of the Outbreak distribution park at 5:20 in the morning, and I went up onto the embankment behind the fence and sat down into the wet grass. And I waited. It is an enormous place. 6 sheds, each the size of the baths 20 times over, and a lorry park, and a staff car park with, I would guess, 11 or 1,200 spaces. At 6:02, they came out. I do not know how many. Hundreds. They came out of the doors at the end of Shed 3, and they walked, unhurried, in the loose way a shift walks when it is clocked off, out across the tarmac and into the car park. And they went to cars, and they stood at the cars. Not one of them got in, because the getting in requires a key and a hand that remembers a pocket. And some of them did put their hands to their pockets, and I sat on that embankment and watched hundreds of people stand at their own cars in the half-light with their hands at their pockets. There was a red hatchback in the 3rd row from the fence, and Lewis had a red hatchback, and there was somebody standing at the driver's door of it in a dark jacket. I got up. I got as far as the fence, and I had my hands in the wire. And I did not go and look. That is the end of the part of this account that matters. Everything I have written down is the account of a man who needed to be authorized. And there, with my hands in that fence at 6:04 in the morning, was the one place in 9 weeks where nobody on earth could have given me permission or taken it away, and where the whole question was mine. And I turned round. I have gone over it so many times that the going over has worn smooth and stopped meaning anything. I have told myself that there were 400 people between me and that car. There were not. There was open tarmac and a fence I could have gone over. I have told myself I had 22 people depending on me in a building 9 miles away, and that is true. And it is also the exact shape of every excuse I have ever made. I have told myself I already knew, and that going closer would only have made the knowing worse. And I think that one might be honest. And I do not think honest is the same as good. What I actually thought, standing there in the words I actually thought it in, was, I am not supposed to be here. I walked back along the rail path in daylight, which was stupid, and got in at 4 in the afternoon, which was worse. And Colin Sowerby had the gate open before I was 50 yards off, which means he had been in the yard watching for 3 or 4 hours, and he did not ask me anything at all. He said, Comfort's got the pool half full. And I said that was good. And he said, you'll want to see to your hands. And I looked, and there was wire rust and blood across both palms from the fence, and I had not noticed. We were there another 3 weeks. In the 2nd week of May, a proper convoy came, with soldiers who were 19 and polite and had no idea what a slipper bath was. And they had a list of premises, and Bethel Street Baths was on it. And I want to say that I found that reassuring, and I did not. They took 13 of us out to a reception center at the old airfield. And they left 10 because 10 of us would not go, and I was one of the 10, and Comfort was another, and so was Darius Wolak, because 5 of his residents were not movable in the back of a lorry, and he was not going to watch anybody try. There were places, by then, in the reception system for people who could walk. There were no places for people who could not. And a young officer with a clipboard told me that, apologetically, standing the polite distance back from my doorway, he said, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I asked him who had sent him. He gave me a regiment and a name and a rank, and I stood there for a second with the whole of February in my mouth. And then I said thank you and let him get on. We are at a school now, 3 miles south, in the sports hall and the 2 blocks behind it, And there are 140 of us, and it works about as well as anything works. I do the same job. There's a trailer and 2 lads and a bad hand truck. And when somebody dies in the block, I go and get them. And I say their name once, early, and I do the practical thing. I have not once, since April, told a family a simplified version of anything. It makes the 4 minutes worse. I do it anyway. Errol Beckles is here. Bridget Nowak is at the airfield doing something with records, and I get a note from her every few weeks. Hamza Qureshi went out to Gascoigne Street in June with 2 other men and came back with his brother's wife and one of the children. And he brought them here, and he speaks to me now, ordinarily, about practical things, and I would not describe what is between us as repaired. He does not owe me that. Nobody has explained the vehicles. I have asked 11 people, including 2 with lanyards and an authority behind them. And the best I got was from a woman at the airfield who said there had been a lot of contracted survey work commissioned very late, and that a lot of it had been commissioned twice by different people who did not know about each other, and that she personally thought half of it had been about deciding where to put things, and the other half about deciding who to tell. She said it kindly, and she may well be right. And it does not touch the fact that a man stood on my step with a folder and used a word he had been given. I still count. It is not a comfort, and I do not do it on purpose. I count the ways into the hall at night. There are 7, and 2 of them are bad. I count comforts boxes on a Sunday. And there is 1 count I have not been able to finish since February, and I expect I never will. On the 2nd morning, from the corner, there were 11 of the 14 left. By the Friday, when we drove out, there were 4. In April, from the gallery window, with the leaves not on yet, I could see down Cropper Lane. And there was 1, black, square, nose to the back gate of the baths, engine off, tires flat, nobody in it. And there it stayed, all through the wet and the thaw and the spring. And it was still there in May when the lorries came. And I asked one of the 19-year-olds to look in it, and he said there was nothing in it at all. 13 of them went somewhere. Somebody drove them away. Somebody parked that one and did not come back for it. And I have never been able to decide which of those 2 facts I mind more. Comfort is shouting me from the far end of the hall now, because Terence Adiemi needs shifting out of the draft by the fire door, and it takes 2 of us. And the hand truck has a left caster that sticks and drags on a hard floor and gives you away in a quiet room. I'm going to go and do that. Mind the caster, I will say, when we lift him, and he will say something back about the state of my equipment, and Comfort will take the head end because she is better at it, and we will move him 11 feet, and it will take us 4 minutes.